Okay, so first of all, thanks to Kayan and to Jakubas for having organized this great conference. I think the papers gel really well, and I think it's also good that we have in the discussions sort of moved towards some of the big underlying questions, and my paper in a way sort of speaks to this, speaks to some of these big questions. But from a perspective of the repeating charge of Eurocentrism that has been leveled in the last 5 to 10 years against political Marxism in particular, but also against the theory of uneven and combined development. So I want to sort of see what whether this holds, in particular in relation to Brenner's work, partly my own work. I then want to move the discussion a little bit towards interrogating and investigating uneven and combined development, and I don't mean here the weaker version that you defend, but the way in which it has been expounded in international historical sociology at large, particularly by Justin Rosenberg, my colleague in the Sussex IR department, who does actually suggest that uneven and combined development is a universal law of world history, with import for understanding not only capitalism in international history at large, indeed going back to the Neolithic revolution. And I want to conclude by suggesting that when I think it is true that from within the political Marxist tradition, there's a relatively little work out there that reflects on the extra-European contribution to the rise of the West, although there's of course some. To me, there's nothing really in the method of political Marxism that a priori precludes it from doing exactly that kind of work. And I think this has to do with what I take to be the methodological core of political Marxism, and that is it's a radical historicism. And at that point, I think, Andreas, you and I have perhaps different readings or different understandings of political Marxism, at least as it was articulated initially in the first generation of political Marxists by Brenner and by Wood. So my first step then is to just quickly go through how Eurocentrism is being defined. I think there are at least three aspects that seem to prevail, or that have been certainly sort of launched against Brenner's and my own work. That is this, and some of these concepts are really quite extravagant. The one is this charge of methodological internalism, namely this idea that somehow Europe's takeoff can be fully explained and understood with reference to some kind of self-propelling attributes that are unique to Europe as a whole, to the exclusion really of non-European agency in generating or co-generating Europe's takeoff. That's one understanding. The second understanding is somehow a normative or triumphalist commitment to Europe's historical priority that casts the East as developmentally inferior, and also the further charge that there's a suppression of the violent and exploitative processes inherent in colonialism and imperialism, and then perhaps a broader conception of history that posits something like a linear developmentalism, universalizing a stadial and unilinear assumption of progress that posits that all societies need to traverse sooner or later the same stages of development first pioneered by Europe. Now, much of this generic definition or charge of Eurocentrism was initially, of course, labeled against modernization theory, right, or liberal understandings, conceptions of histories, but they are very present as well in these ongoing critiques of contemporary Marxist understandings of world history in IR, international historical sociology. So I have three prima facie points to make, which is really more about really setting straight the record, and attentive readers can really go back to the relevant literatures to ascertain what I'm going to say. Now, Brenner's rise, story of the transition to capitalism, is of course not Eurocentric, it is Anglocentric. And I think that matters because what he actually says is that there's nothing really inherent in Europe as a unit of analysis, however you want to define it, geographically or culturally, that privileges it somehow a priori or teleologically to move towards capitalism or modernity. In his own words, of course, capitalism arose as a result of the unintended consequences of very specific class struggles in the agrarian countryside from the 14th century onwards. So whether or not other regions within or outside Europe, Holland, Catalonia, the Italian Renaissance city-states, or even the Yangtze Delta did or did not develop capitalism is simply a matter of research. Okay? It's not a matter of adhering a priori to some kind of metaphysical conception of Europe that perhaps we see more in Max Weber's original understanding of rationalization. Nor did he or I exclude the possibility that there are pockets of capitalist relations of production in specific locales and sectors outside of or prior to the late 14th century, but rather I think what is unique, and here I do agree with Neil, is that in England, I think, and that was unique to England, capitalist property relations generated actually the capture of state power, right, by the capitalist classes, by the 17th century, 1688, so that we see a transformation of state power as well, that is the rise of parliamentary sovereignty, right, the arrogation of the ruling classes of state power, and the end of divine authority, dynasticism, however much it is still there, ornamentically, as an ornament, right, in the form and the constitution of the English state. So in other words, I mean, if capitalism had grown in Luxembourg or Zanzibar, right, there are issues of scale as well, and these are historically specific. Second, Brenner and PM, I think, more widely do not adhere to some kind of, it's just happening from within inside the English box. There's no such thing as autonomism or unilinearism. Because Brenner adopts from the very start, right, a research design that is self-consciously international and it is multilinear. And Brenner did not rule out or ignore, of course, potential impact of extra-European factors on the rise of capitalism in Europe. It's the opposite. He engaged very judiciously, right, with acknowledging these, but then refuting them as well. And two of which stand out in particular. That is the Black Death, right, and the impact of the epidemiology of the Black Death on populations and the land-labor ratio in England. And of course, although he did acknowledge the impact of the Black Death, for him the decisive thing was simply to say, right, well, look around in a comparative perspective, right, the Black Death hit, of course, various regions in Europe. In all other regions of Europe, bar England, right, it deepened and prolonged the feudal crisis of the 14th century, and then led to the reconstitution of feudal relations, including the second serfdom in East Albia, right, in Eastern Europe. But only in England, actually, did the Black Death contribute to the transformation of property relations, right, so that one cause had multiple effects, and if that is the case, then you have to refract the impact of this cause, right, through class rights and pre-existing class relations. Therefore, he drew the analyst back really to the endogenous specificity of class relations in the English agrarian countryside. So, what seems to me, what is often overlooked, therefore, is that I think it was this kind of comparative perspective that from the very start sort of looked at different outcomes of external pressures on different regions of Europe, I think is a methodological strategy So that simply cannot assume that there's somehow a background assumption that all societies go in lockstep and march in unison through various modes of production. It's the opposite, right? He from the very start had a research design that breaks with that and therefore dismisses classical Marxist teleological conceptions of stagism. Now the other, of course, external presence that he did acknowledge, but then also refute judiciously, was the presence of markets, right? The impact of trading opportunities. Of course, he said they were there, they were all around. I mean, you cannot think about the rise of capitalism without acknowledging the presence of export markets. Textile markets in Flanders, high-end goods in northern Italy. Of course, they did present opportunities. But again, his argument was these could not in and of themselves transform pre-capitalist property relations. It is not that suddenly lords in the 14th century looked around and said, hey, there's an export market in textile, therefore let's transform property relations on the ground. The presence of markets, as Brenner argued so clearly, in this case, grain exports to England, yet in East Albia to the deepening of feudal social property relations, and in France to petty peasant ownership and sharecropping. Inversely, export opportunities did not per se transform property relations in England, but only in England was the opportunity of the presence of the Flemish textile market seized and activated through the transformation of arable land cultivated for diverse local markets to more monocultural pasture for sheep breeding, feeding into the Flemish wool markets. But this was dependent on the prior dissolution of feudal relations of production into agrarian capitalism, which then enabled the reorientation of commodity production for export purposes. Thus, P.M. foul of the third charge of Eurocentrism, that is the suppression of the violent and exploitative processes inherent in colonialism and imperialism, so capitalism outbound. Now, of course, Alan Wood has written a lot on this, but again, I want to restrict myself here to Brenner. And as I said earlier, I think it is important to recognize that Brenner made a categorical distinction between the old company merchants and the new interlopers. Okay? The former reproduce themselves through age-old mercantilist practices, buying cheap, selling dear, that is excluding competition, backed up by royal charters that confer trading monopolies in specific sectors and with specific European and extra-European regions to specific companies. For Brenner, the rise of a new British entrepreneurial merchant class, the colonial interloping traders, came to challenge these monopolies from the late 16th century onwards. This was much of the essence of the 17th century civil war. And these new interlopers started to organize production in the Americas themselves, including through the establishment of plantations, sugar, tobacco, and cane worked by slaves. So Brenner did not only address the world outside Europe, drawing out the relation between the rise of agrarian capitalism in 16th century Britain and the emerging split between the old colonial merchants and the new interloping traders during the Stuart regimes. He directly tracked their involvement in overseas colonialism, slavery, and imperialism. He even suggested that many of these new traders, these new merchants, started to organize a triangular slave trade between London, West Africa, and the West Indies. Brenner developed this argument as early as 1972 and it's expanded it significantly in his 1993 monograph, Merchants and Revolutions. What he did not examine, so he did not examine the profits from the slave trades, how they further developed capitalism in England. I think that is true. He made the argument that the slave trade was the premise of the prior reorganization property relations in England itself. So that's also a question of chronology. Okay, I think this can all be looked up, and okay, this is just to rectify what I think are sometimes really quite shrill accusations leveled against Brenner, and partly my own work as well. So, how does this then look for uneven and combined development? Part of my reference here is a book by Jan Jevers and Nisan Stioglu, which some of you have read, and who made that charge in particular. So there's an historical empirical argument to be made. But I think the more important issue really is to reflect on the type of theory, the status of the theory at UCD actually pretends to be as a theory of world history, and to me it really has a lot to do with its nomothetic or its nomological, law-like character, and some of the core conceptuality that it uses. The international, and in particular the notion of development as being categories that can be easily universalized across the historical record. The final thing is it has to do with agency, Whenever you articulate a theory, as a law, then it becomes very difficult, to bring in agency as an active category. Okay, the first point is relatively easily dealt with. Nisan Stioglu and Jan Jevers, they do want to bring in back the Black Death and overseas markers, but they also insist on yet another externality, what they think is in PM an externality. And here I think the Ottoman Empire for them plays a significant role by saying that, by insisting that the demilitarization of the English lordly class was a decisive precondition for the lord's inability to continue feudal extra-economic coercion. And this was a function, of the Ottoman-Habsburg conflict that, so the argument goes, permitted ruling class cohesion and demilitarization in England by deflecting the Habsburg threat, the military threat, away from England towards the Balkans. Now this, I think, is a very speculative argument, it's almost like a counterfactual. But I think it needs to be noted that serious Ottoman-Habsburg conflict started only from the mid-16th century onwards, thus well after the decline of serfdom in England, which was more or less completed by the middle of the 15th century. Furthermore, and I think Neil, you made the point yourself, England was not isolated from military conflict in the 15th or the 16th century. The wars with France, Ireland, and Scotland, I think, were near permanent. But this is not really necessarily about nitpicking about this or that example, that these defenders of UCD make in order to somehow weaken the coherence of the Brennerite story. It is a problem of the notion of the underlying causality, So the notion of causality actually used by Jan Jevers and Nisan Stioglu is extremely weak, so you get a long sort of additive shopping list of necessary contributions to the rise of the West or the rise of capitalism in England. But nothing there is actually never really sufficient. Okay? So I think this makes it, potentially expandable. It leads towards an idea of infinite regress, that X number of preconditions have to be in place to enable the rise of capitalism in England. And if you want to be facetious, you could also say that, humanity's capacity to work upright somehow has to register as the factor, as some kind of necessary predetermination for the rise of capitalism in England. Now, the other problem with that book seems to me is that what we do see is a kind of a reverse Eurocentrism, So everything really fixates on Northwestern Europe, and the rest of the extra-European empires that they want to induce in order to make their argument about the exteriority, external factors for capitalism, becomes simply a prelude, And it's only read in its usefulness for understanding how the West took off. So these are some of these sort of empirical issues. Moving on to the UCD itself and the kind of sort of theory it represents, I mean, what it is so almost, as far as I can see, certainly in Justin Rosenberg's book, is premised on as an epistemological exercise. What I mentioned, you know, the emphasis on law likeness, and let's quickly sort of recall actually what it says substantively. I'm not sure if this was, you know, fully represented in your presentation here. The idea really is, is that more advanced policies leash the whip of extra necessity mediated through the international on backward states who enjoy this apparent privilege of backwardness, forcing them to skip stages and catch up hothouse fashion, leading to combined development. Okay, so there's a strong version in Justin. It's a world historical law. Neil restricts it to capitalist history per se. Problem is that this law-like character is really never really fully revoked. So it really looks to me very much like a covering law. And if that is so for nomological, nomothetic, I mean, I'm referring here really back to the debates that we had in the 19th century in German historiography between the idiographers who emphasized the event as specific and unique, over and against the defenders of nomothetic approaches to history that looked very much towards classical political economy in Scotland as a model on how to do that. So it is more like a covering law, and the danger this invites is that history is only ever read as confirming an a priori law, whereby history is forced into this kind of Procrustean parameters, but not really ever tested against it with the possibility of falsifying its premises. I think it leads to selection bias and a tendency towards self-immunization from disconfirming evidence. I could cite dozens of examples in history, right, where societies on contact with more advanced states de-developed, right, or non-developed. Right. And the famous quote, of course, is from dependency theory, the development of non-development. Right? So I think there's something to be said about that. The other point, of course, is that if history is really law-like, then agency can do nothing more than acting out a prescribed script. Agency really is reified and purely derivative, dancing to the structuralist tune of the theory. It's the proverbial under-laborer of theory. Now, this does not per se lead to the charge of Eurocentrism against UCD, but I think it looks very much like a prisoner of positivism. Very much a Western idea of the function and purpose of theory. I think this becomes, or Eurocentrism then becomes more drastic and becomes more drastically to the fore as development and the international, which I think are really sort of modernist European categories, distinctly European categories, that are then projected back into history as large, thereby undergoing a process of dehistoricization. Development, Entwicklung, progress, Fortschritt, as any semantic history will tell us, are of course notions that belong to the 18th century, right, to a particular experience, and enter the political lexicon at that point in time. The notion of the international, I think, is also a specifically European notion. If we think about the international being premised on a series of territorial discrete political jurisdiction, then it is something that comes into being in the 18th century during the period of absolutism. Prior to that, if you look at feudal territoriality, there's no such thing actually as an inter. It's an hierarchical political order or geopolitical order based on vassalic relations. It's the opposite of what emerged after the 17th century, where you have a series of at least formally equal states that exercise their own sovereignty over their own territories. So the distinction between the internal and the external, I think, is itself an historical phenomenon. So, I mean, these are just some reflections on what is problematic about U&CD and its historical application, but also as a type of theory it presents. So, okay, how then can we sort of think about political Marxism slightly differently, and to get it perhaps out of this constant association with England? Now, for that, I think we need a clarification of what I said at the beginning of my talk, right? What is, I think, present in Brenner and Wood, right? Two strands of how to conceive of capitalism and capital history. I think they coexist, and they're not really fully reflected in their own work. The one has to do indeed with social property relations, okay? That is more sort of an analytical or logical definition of feudalism and capitalism, and the other has to do with emphasizing situated class conflict and moving towards historical specificity. So, on the one hand, you have this logical derivation. If you have a certain set of social property relations, feudal or capitalist, then you also get a certain set of rules of reproduction, okay? Particular strategies that are being assigned to collective actors on both sides of the class divide. For feudalism, it happens to be, right, in case of the peasant, safety first considerations, subsistence economy, having many kids, and so on the class of feudal lords, it's about reinvesting the means of coercion, you know, to continue the practice of using extra economic power to take a surplus from the direct producers. For capitalists, in Brenner and in Wood, it has a lot to do with market dependency. Right. Both producers and non-producers have to be subjected under the imperatives of the market. Okay. So this does involve, of course, separation of the direct producer from the means of reproduction, rendering them landless, but it also means for Brenner that lords lose their ability to appropriate surplus through means of coercion or through military means. But he does this at places in very sort of ideotypical, static terms, right? Saying this is really what we need to do when we historicize. We need to look at these two big ideal types, and this will tell us a lot about capitalist history. But in these more historicist moments, I think there are these two registers at play, right? The analytical and the more historicist. The argument is precisely the opposite. It is about emphasizing, right, class power, not in the abstract, but situated in a very specific, you know, concrete historical locale. And at that point in time, I think, you know, he shows, and he does a detailed work on the rise of capitalism in Britain, that it is, you know, classes, you try to navigate a particular context, okay? This is not pre-given somehow, engage in contest over the nature of the new regime, and have presto, after a while, okay, a particular new configuration emerges, which looks more like capitalism, however much you want to define it. So, to me, I think we need to go away from that, this analytical definition, capitalism as a theoretical category, and think about what it means to think about capitalism as an historical practice, okay? And not something that you can just logically sort of extrapolate and derive and then just superimpose it on history. For me, okay, this is in the end never really the task of providing yet another grand theory. So for me, it's a question of method, right? And this can be quite concrete. You know, it's almost like giving advice to an MA students on how to, right, build up your research design. And I think I want to end by just sketching out a few steps on how to do this, some kind of research method for doing not just historical sociology, but the historical sociology of international politics. So I think it's clear that you always need to make some kind of pragmatic choice for a specific research design, identifying a unit of analysis, drawing a boundary around what it is that we want to research, what are the relevant players here, what are the issues. This needs to be quite well contained, and it needs to be question driven, and it needs to be puzzle driven. Otherwise you have this problem of infinite historical regress. Everything needs to be in the theory of everything. So once we've done this, I'm talking here about a particular international kind of research design. I think we should never be endowed with some kind of preconceived substantive logic. In IR, of course, there are these ideas that statesmen act out, assume territorial logics, right? Or in Morgenthau, right? I'm interested in power maximization. Okay? Let's get rid of that from the start. Okay? Anything like that, yeah, downgrades history and agency and really cannot explain specificity, a specific event. So let's sort of take these logic, these ascriptions out and away. You then need still to sort of fill this environment, once we have this research design, with certain attributes, okay? We need to establish a context, a particular distribution of power, property regimes, classes, state forms, institutions, for sure. But then I think the important point, and that takes us from Brenner and from Wood, is then to flip the perspective around by populating these contexts with agents, okay? Party politicians, classes, statesmen, stateswomen, crucially I would say diplomats, foreign policy elites, not as generic categories or as bearers of logics, but as active and situated agents who navigate this context, that deliberate different courses of action. Different courses of action are always possible, and need to make compromises and innovate in the process. To my mind, there's always a hermeneutic perspective, right? That's another problem. The purpose of this exercise, for me, right, is to start by saying there's always a causative gap between a particular context, structural imperatives, and a particular outcome, right? This gap can only be closed, I think, if we trace agency all the way down, agentic creativity, ask ourselves what difference do foreign policy elites and diplomats actually make to turn a set of antecedent structural conditions and expectations into a non-derivable outcome, a non-derivable result. To my mind, this leads to an open-ended process. And again, here's the emphasis back, the relation back to Brenner. The open-endedness of class struggle, there's nothing pre-given. Okay? And to the wide embrace of, I think, a radical historicism. So it's a question for me of method, not of general theory. And to my mind, there's nothing in this method that cannot travel outside the confines of Europe towards extra-European spaces. Okay, I leave it here. Thank you.